Welcome to Redundancy Matters with me, June Hogan. So this is the podcast where I help HR professionals and leaders managing redundancies to put people at the heart of the process. And in today's episode, I'm joined by Aime Ayrehart. Aime is someone who brings a perspective on redundancy that you don't often hear. Because Aime has led HR teams in large organisations, but she's also experienced what it's like to be on the other side, as she's the founder of the HR and Workers Trade Union and now supports individuals as a trade union representative. So she's the person people call on when things become difficult at work. So that combination gives her a really unique insight into redundancy, not just how it's meant to work, but how it's actually experienced by people. And in our conversation, we explore what can get lost when processes take over and why redundancy can feel so much harder than it looks on paper. And also, what makes a real difference when you're sitting across from someone in those times. So if you're leading or supporting redundancies, I hope you find our conversation helpful. So let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to today's episode of Redundancy Matters, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Aime Ayrehart. Now, I was thinking about how to introduce Aime in the best way. She's going to do a much better job of it than me when she introduces herself in a moment. But I've known Aime for a few years through our journeys into being independents, and Aime has vast experience as a HR professional, and she's also the founder and leader of the HR Workers Trade Union, which, if you haven't heard about it, is something which she's going to talk about a bit later. So somebody with lots of experience on both sides of the table, supporting individuals, supporting organisations, and fundamentally at the heart of it all, Aime is someone who's very purpose-led, values-driven, and everything that she does comes from the heart. So Aime, I'm so pleased to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I was very excited. It's always a great opportunity to talk to similar people with a similar mindset. So thank you.
Ah, wonderful. So that was my quick introduction, but tell us a bit more about you, what you do now and what's led you to what you do now, and just give the listeners a bit more of an insight into who you are.
Thank you. It's a sort of messy journey and complicated. So my background was mostly senior public sector HR. So I ran HR departments in the NHS, local government, until I whistle blew. And I guess I then had to sit on the other side of the table. But it was quite hard to get support from trade unions, not because they're not fabulous, but because most of the time HR and trade unions are working in conflict, let's say. We work together, but it's still, so it made it a little bit difficult. And I felt a little bit isolated. So when my case went through, and I did write an Amazon bestseller about it, I suddenly realized also that because I'd stuck to my guns and defended staff at work, even though I was HR, I'd broken some kind of internal corporate code where I was supposed to do whatever the organization and especially the chief exec said. I mean, I never read that. And I always thought my job in HR was to balance, but apparently not always so. And I think the best HR people do exactly that, actually. But I did have a tendency, I'll be honest, to support staff, probably more than fight for dodgy bosses. So I thought, well, what on earth am I going to do now? Because I've pretty much blown up my career. So I set up a trade union. In fact, I tried to apply to trade unions, but they said I didn't have enough experience. So I thought, oh, well, there's one way of doing this. And I did it myself. And I wanted to help people who would struggle to find help other ways. So they were either HR people, and that can be difficult to find reps, or in industries or in jobs. So directors or salespeople or even people on minimum wage who've never heard of a trade union. So fundamentally, what we do is we're a pay-as-you-go trade union who helps people get into struggles at work and really have nowhere else to turn. They perhaps have tried the trade unions or they need more support. And that's where it comes from, the heart-led stuff, because, sometimes I do some for free. I have to charge as well to make, a living, but it is about trying to help people when they get into sticky situations at work.
And I remember when you set up the trade union.
Well, it's actually 6 years now, which has gone surprisingly quickly.
Wow.
But yeah, it's quite established. And I was just looking that, because from time to time, employers try and challenge it. But last year I was in the High Court defending client who I'd represented and the judge sits on the employment appeal tribunals and was an employment lawyer. And this top shop barrister sort of said, well, she's not really a trade union. And the judge stepped in and defended me. And I've just found today that it's all in the documentation to say we are a trade union. And that is a bit waffly, but it's like, I literally just decided one day, in fact, the 2nd of December 2019, that it was going to exist. And because it's anti-establishment, if you do it, it exists. But actually being recognised in the High Court by a very experienced employment appeal judge was very satisfying. I'm like I was legitimate. Does that make sense? But I'm like properly legitimate now.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. And I remember you posted, there was some photos
Yeah.
you posted on LinkedIn, obviously not about the detail, but I remember thinking, go Amy, when was all that. So yeah, and I'm sure there's stories that you'll be able to share with us, particularly as I'm sure you'll have supported people in redundancy situations, particularly when it's gone wrong. So why does redundancy matter to you then?
I think because it is a process. I mean, I have been made redundant. I have made other people redundant. I've now supported people through the trade union who've been made redundant. And organisations often treat it as a neutral process. But emotionally and relationship-wise, it is not a neutral process, especially if it comes from nowhere and you thought you were going to stay forever. So I think it matters to me because it matters to people. It hurts. It can be upsetting. It can be discombobulating, because even if you're happy with it and you've agreed to it, you then got to get another job probably. Or even if, let's say, you walk out with, you and I know that people don't often get as much money as they think they're going to get, right? But even if people walk out with lots of money, it's still a change to their life. It's still, what is my, who am I? What is my purpose in life? So it is a complicated, messy, emotional process. So it matters because it matters to people. I also think it matters because there's a lot of shame or hidden things about these kind of things happening. So I sometimes find that clients have told the world on Facebook that, I don't know, some weird medical fact, or they come out as gay or whatever, but they don't talk about things that are uncomfortable at work. And sometimes they haven't even told their partners, their best friend. And so they're really, really alone. But if you lose a job like this, people don't seem to want to talk about it. So it's the fact it's very emotional, but also I think it's something that's so hidden. And I think that, you're nodding, but of course they can't see you nodding. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That makes sense a lot. But does that make sense from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And the shame of redundancy is huge. And it's something that I carried for a long time, but didn't realize that's what it was. And I do notice it in clients. And I worked with an organization many years ago, and these people were newly qualified early on in their career and in a large corporate organization and highly thought of, but business had a downturn and they were no longer needed. And none of them wanted to talk about redundancy. They did not want to talk about it in an interview. They didn't want to talk about it to anyone, and just wanted to find ways to brush it under the carpet or find different ways to talk about it. And the shame was there in the room, and it was really palpable. And I do see that a lot. You're right. People will reveal all sorts of things, but do they rarely talk about job loss?
Exactly. And I think that's kind of why we get on and we've chatted over the years, isn't it? Because we are often from a different perspective, helping people through the same process.
Absolutely. And so in your work as a trade union rep, and I love the fact that you do this work with all of the HR experience that you bring into the room. And I've often said, if I was ever in a situation where I needed someone in the room with me, then you would be my number one choice. And I recommend you to friends. Yeah, no, absolutely. I recommend you all the time. So from your experience, what have you noticed that kind of goes wrong in a redundancy consultation process?
I think although people tend to think it's process, actually, if you're reasonably well qualified and trained, you get the process right. But what I think goes wrong is the emotions and the relationship stuff. And what tends to happen is the people doing the process, whether that's managers, HR, need to manage their own emotions. And you and I have been there. If you're trying to make lots of people redundant and they're crying because they're saying they don't know how they'll pay the bills, unless you're a psychopath, that is not a nice thing to do, right? What I think managers and HR people do as a self-protection mechanism is they make it very formulaic and very logical, very process driven. And that is very good in terms of protecting you from, like, you won't get sued if you do the process right. But the more they do that, the more emotionally uncomfortable it feels the other side of the table. So the more you make it about, well, if you say something like, if a manager says, well, we've done a matrix and calculated you're not as good as this person, okay? That's really good in court. That'll defend you. If someone says that to you, so you've calculated what is important. You've done some sort of mathematical thing, and then you've decided I'm not good enough. It's like, so ironically, in trying to make it very logical and procedural, they make the emotions they're experiencing on the other side of the table worse. And of course, it then spirals, because the more you make the other person feel uncomfortable, not intentionally, the more they get upset. Then often HR people and managers get defensive. It just escalates. So that's what goes wrong, I think. It is people forgetting that we are all human. And it doesn't matter how you put a chief exec or a very senior person. And when you've been in HR long enough and senior enough for long enough, you've seen chief execs in tears and shouting at each other. Everybody has emotions. They might hide them well. Some deal with them better than others. So I think forgetting all of that is then people wonder, well, why did they react badly at this? Well, because it's terrible. And whereas actually and I still make some redundancies, to be in the room and not try and pretend it's not uncomfortable, to try and take it and notice the feelings, but still hold them, is fundamentally difficult to do. And actually, what I did was I'm not suggesting this as a training strategy for most. I tend to be a bit extreme. I trained myself as a Samaritan, and I went and worked in a mental health hospital with some of the most long-term patients that are struggling, to teach myself how to deal with any emotions, so that I could not, because I don't want to lose my humanity. We all know HR people who, from self-protection, they put walls up, don't they? It's trying to make it all more human and trying to find a way through, but recognizing it's usually very difficult for everybody around the table. Occasionally it isn't, but that's dead easy. It's like someone just goes, yeah, package, fine, I'm off. Like, well, that's okay. But it can really hit people. I mean, you're the other end of it, aren't you? You're helping organizations deal with it, but you're also helping individuals deal with it. I would imagine you get the full remit of people's emotions once they've got through the door, right?
Yeah. And what you said there about the matrix and the scoring, and here's numbers 1 to 10 and you came out at the bottom, all that kind of thing. Yes, of course, that's necessary, that's procedural, that's required. It has to be objective, has to be completed in the right way, moderated, all of that good stuff that we know about. But the language that you're using, it can be unfamiliar to people because they've never been in this situation before. And as you say, you've reduced them down to a place on a spreadsheet, and they've been there 25 years and done whatever's requested of them, never had a conversation about performance, never had any issues or challenges around that. And I think the shock of redundancy can be combined with, if this is the first time they've ever been aware of anything being an issue in the workplace at all. And that can be really hard for people to piece together. And what I do see is, going back to the rationale, whether it's one person or 100 people, that's really important for people, as you say, to try and understand this at what can be a very vulnerable time for some. So I think getting clear on the rationale at the start and making sure that you can demonstrate it, communicate it, and that people can connect with the fact that this is hard for everyone, as you say, I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think it's being realistic about how much the employee will take in. I think one of the things that being a rep is all about is just being there with them to help them, support them. We can step in and argue, and we can actually do quite a lot. You'd be surprised. And in fact, in certain circumstances, when there's extreme risk to the employee, mental health usually, I'll step in and literally become the go-between, which actually HR are often pleased about because they're like, we don't have to deal with this. If there's someone in between, that's better. But I think, ironically, sometimes saying less. So say the minimum you've got to. Does that make sense? Like if you've got a matrix in front of you, you explain the broad things, but don't labour each point. Like you were really rubbish in last year's sales figures and you were, you do you know what I mean? Because people just can't. It's too much. Also, I guess, and I understand it, there's a presumption, let's get through this as quickly as possible. But you know this, it takes people time to process. So it might be very efficient to sit someone down for 15 minutes, tell them they've been put at risk, but often they don't hear anything after the first sentence. The strangest I ever had was actually with my HR hat on, was 4 people in a team, and we were going to change each of their jobs. But we were going to offer, they were all going to have the same salary and a job, right? But we turned up, we'd done all the right thing. I saw one person the day after and said, "How are you?" And she said, "I didn't see you yesterday, Amy." And I'm like, what? You know, when you think that was yesterday. Anyway, I went and found the trade union rep because I had an HR hat on at that time. And she did have that meeting yesterday. She was there. She says, yeah, she's completely psychologically blanked it. She is literally denying it ever happened. And I'm like, oh, that is extreme. Like, that is the most extreme reaction I've ever had. But that can happen, right? She was like, we've never had a meeting putting me at risk of redundancy. And I'm like, we were all there. The trade union rep was there. Like, I don't know whether you've ever had one of those before, but that was shocking.
No, I've never had that. I have in my own experience, and when I used to manage redundancy processes and through talking to clients through outplacement, is that you're right. Once you hear the words, your role is at risk of redundancy, the rest of it is just a blur. And I think that point that you made there about you don't have to get all the information out in one go. Yes, there's a procedure to follow, but just bombarding people with all of this stuff and ticking the box and saying, we told you all this, so right, done, we'll see you in 2 weeks. That's not going to work for everyone, and that's not going to be particularly helpful. So this notion of, well, actually, what do we have to say? What procedurally has to happen? Yes, that's important. How do we say it in a way that makes it human, person-centered, kind? And then if that means we need to have 4 meetings instead of 2, then that's what we'll do. So I think it's about connecting with the individual.
I think so. And I would say there's a balance. And if you spend a bit more time, and I appreciate there's a cost involved in that. And that's why I think what you do is fabulous, because if organizations haven't always got the emotional bandwidth and the skills to be able to support people through the process. But I'd be like, if I could force everybody to get your services, I would, because it will help them. That's the irony. It will be like, okay, it may seem like I'm not saying you're expensive, but like people are like, well, it's more than 5p, so it's expensive, right? You will make your life so much easier. And because I've seen redundancy processes where they've started it and it's still going 2 or 3 years later, or the people have got together and actually essentially caused so much fuss that none of it's happened.
Yeah. And there is that balance, as you say, between commercially what needs to happen if you've got financial year end deadlines. But then when you're in the planning stages, working with the leadership team saying, yes, we could do it in a month, but actually, I think it's more reasonable to suggest 6 weeks. Therefore, we need to start middle of January to get through to the end of March, whatever. So I guess putting some of that in place up front to give you some breathing space. So in redundancy consultations, we talked about making sure that you're really thinking about the individual. So what do you think that as a profession, when we're going into these consultations, what do we need to be doing more or less of, given that theme that we talked about earlier?
So I think some of it, as I say, is just remembering the emotions and where the other person is. But I think when you're doing redundancy consultation, there's specifically an issue about trust. And people have learnt to basically say things like, this is what we're proposing, but obviously you can change anything and everything, and we haven't made a decision. And what over time I think people have started to realize is that's just not true. That actually they can say something and it might change a bit of it, but the chances are, depending on the process, obviously, but actually if it's a large scale, then they probably won't be able to change it. And so people perceive it, correctly or incorrectly, as hugely disingenuous. So I think trying to be as honest as you can, especially about reasons, because a lot of employees aren't clued into the sort of strategic top level financial decision making. So they often take it personally. So they think they're just getting at me. So I think being honest about the commercial reality is helpful. So if I have made people redundant in my own team where I've gone, I don't want to make you redundant. The finances are this. I've thought of it. I tried to think through everything I can, but I've got to save X amount of money. I don't really want to lose anyone, but I don't feel like I've got a choice. If you could come up with any scheme or suggestion that will get out of this, then tell me, because that it lands very differently than a kind of, but it takes risk, because it takes risk that you tell them too much or tell them. But I found overall that trusting the employee and not treating them like an idiot works better. And explaining the honest reasons, tell them as much as they can in the right context about kind of why, because you can be kind at the same time. I once got a thank you letter after dismissing someone, which I'll take as a career high. And what I've also found is that employees genuinely believe they've got no ability to change anything. And yet, when I help them, so for example, just saying at a consultation meeting, I really want to stay, I really want to do this, this, and this, can have a difference, because you can think, okay, well, equally, I've been in organizations where individuals have offered, or I've suggested, where they've said, look, if I work part-time for 6 months, if I help you out with this project to try and get some more income, it's like, you know what, those work a lot more often than you might think.
I love what you said there, Amy, about that theme of almost like it's vulnerability and encouraging HR professionals and leaders within their own boundaries. You said you're a very open person. So when you were having those discussions, it was just your natural style to put it and tell it how it was. But I think there does need to be a level of vulnerability in the process without abdicating responsibility and things like, if it was me, then I wouldn't be doing this, because that's a different message to this is, I don't want to lose anyone in the team. You'll understand that we're facing significant financial pressures. I've thought of everything I possibly can. This is a really hard decision. As well as you said at the start there, that language of, well, it's all up for grabs. We can change whatever you like. This is meaningful consultation. Well, essentially, yes, meaningful consultation means, as you've just described there, put your proposals forward, put your ideas, put your suggestions forward. But it's unlikely, if it's a factory closure, that might
say that, like, say that up front and say, it's unlikely you're going to change the massive amount because the factory's going.
Yeah, but you might be able to change the fact that it closes in 6 months as opposed to 3 months, or those sorts of things. So I think you're right. It's about being realistic, being honest, being prepared to be vulnerable, but still, I guess, having that position of, I use the word authority because I can't think of a better one, but you are in charge of the process. They need to know that somebody's guiding them through it. And so when people are in that situation and they're calling on you as a trade union rep, what are some of the benefits that you would say? You mentioned there before about if you've got someone who either isn't taking it in, doesn't understand, has got some mental health challenges, clearly you can step in and speak on their behalf. But what are some of the other benefits that you've noticed when trade unions are working in partnership? I know that's very much what you're all about.
I think there's a piece of research that says that having a best friend at work can make a massive difference to your life, your experience at work. What fundamentally I try and do for a short period of time, and I do charge people, is be that best friend at work to help you through something difficult. But of course, it's the best friend who happens to have a law degree, a psychology degree, a master's in HR, being a senior HR person. It's like having a very specific type of best friend, does that make sense, to get you through that. And that's why when you might not have articulated like that, but when people sort of say, I know who I'd want sitting next to me, or I know who I would advise if it was your daughter or your son or your best mate or whatever, it's, yes, I can do the strategy. And I can also, I would say, I can explain. So often I do some of the HR teams work for them, because we come out of something, they say, well, I don't understand, why did they put, and I like explain, no, that's just standard. That's, like sometimes people take a letter and they think it's hugely personal. I'm like, no, that letter will be sent to, like, that's not, that literally isn't personal. But so I can I mean, when we do learning and development, I will adapt to the learning needs of the person, to what are they understanding about the context they're in. I can also say, because it's very hard, and you get this from an HR perspective. If someone says, do you think my job will go? Like, they want that personal. Am I going to go? Is this? You can't answer that. You really can't answer that question without getting yourself in all sorts of hot water, right?
Yeah.
You can't say it, right? Because it would be inappropriate. But what I can do is say what I genuinely feel. So I can say to people, now read the room. I'll watch people's faces. I'll watch how, and say, actually, I don't think they want to make you redundant, but they really do think the suitable job will be, because again, suitable alternatives sometimes are great and sometimes people are worried about. But I had one case, and it was a very commercial area, and the employee was, obviously I can't tell you actual details, but I can tell you a loose story, where the employee was absolutely certain they were out to get him. And I went in quite strong in the meeting, and halfway through I'm like, I don't think he's ready, right? I think this manager really likes him and wants to keep him. I don't even think there were several people who could have been made redundant. I'm thinking she wants to keep him, not the others. So I switched tack in the middle of the meeting, and geez, it's like, you want to keep this guy, right? And she just went, actually, so okay, so right, okay, so, and even if you can't, she said, yeah, there's some jobs, there might even be a promotion. And this guy ended up with a promotion, and the manager, even though I'd been quite strong, said, "You're like the best trade union rep I've ever met." I'm not sure that's a very big pull, because I don't think she'd necessarily. But the point was, it's seeing things and changing the dynamic in a way. Because you and I, we've sat in those rooms, we know. And I can also sometimes see, because sometimes people are quite naive and they think, I won't go. It's never going to happen. That real denial stuff. And I don't challenge it too much, because I'm not there to shock anyone, but I can see sometimes the way you can read between the lines, right? And you're like, okay, this redundancy might be the best option right now. If they don't go on redundancy, they might find themselves on a PIP in five weeks' time. But this is what I specialize in. And I've just turned it. All the things that chief execs found me annoying because I was challenging, I'm just like, I might as well lean into it then and to make a career out of it, right?
Yeah, and I love the way that you described yourself as someone's best friend at work, but with all your experience, qualifications, and your ability to, as you say, piece things together and spot things and read the room and make those insights, which can be beneficial for both sides, as you say. And it's the partnership approach. And I think my experience of trade unions is not recent, but when I was working with trade unions, it would often be in conflict, which made things very hard. But when you've got someone who actually wants to work in partnership, and clearly, as you say, you just want the best outcome for the individual, that's all you're interested in. So if someone listening to this is listening to this thinking, I need Aime at work, I need to have a best friend like Aime at work, or they're thinking about their organisation and whether this is something they would want to offer to their employees, how can people find you? How can they get in touch? Where do you hang out?
I think, honestly, the simplest answer is social media, isn't it? LinkedIn. I have an unusually spelt name, which is AIME to start with, and then Ayrehart, which is AYREHART. And I'm saying that because obviously people are listening and they can't see it, but there is only one Aime Ayrehart spelled like that on LinkedIn. So instead, like, you just type it in, you'll find me. In fact, if you type it into Google, you'll find me, because it's an unusual name. So find me. And then what I usually do both ends is I call it a magic hour, and it's basically you pay for an hour of my time, but it's like, at the moment, it's at £8 to £9 for individuals. And then you're not invested a huge amount of money or time. It's like, we'll have a conversation and then see what happens. And then with trade union clients, what I then do is I do it on a casework basis. So it's a fixed fee. I'm not everybody's cup of tea, but I don't try to be. It's like, and by the way, the other trade unions are fabulous, but they can't offer what I do because they just don't have the resources. They have the skills and the people, but the amount of time I can put into one client is hugely different to what a typical trade union can. But that's just their costing model. It's not their fault.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might just be what somebody needs, but didn't know that existed. Well, Aime, we've had a whistle-stop tour of all things kind of redundancy, and clearly you don't just deal with that with individuals, but I'm guessing that it does come up quite a lot, even if it's disguised as redundancy and something disguised as something else.
Yeah.
So I found loads of that really useful, and I know that people listening are going to have found it useful as well. And it's just great to hear that perspective that you've got, which is really unique because you are on that other side with people and you've also experienced it as a HR professional. So thank you so much. And I'll pop links to your social media. We'll pop some links to your book as well in the show notes and website and all of that good stuff so people can get in touch. And yeah, thanks so much, Aime. I've really enjoyed our conversation today.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, June.
Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.